The vendor onboarding process today, from a security standpoint, is nothing like it was even 24 months ago. 24 months ago, I don't think there was a single question on what open source software do you use. Now, there's entire forms.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 195. Why do companies not replace legacy systems? Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farson. Victor, can you loan me $20?
No,
Why not?
you don't deserve it.
I don't deserve it? Well, I was going to give it to, one of my side gigs to help them try to get all their old stuff updated. They said $20 would get it fixed.
Now you're definitely not getting it.
Because it would never come back. It would not be an investment, right?
Exactly.
Well, why do companies think they need to be spending a ton of money of their tech budgets to maintain legacy software? Why do you think that is?
Because they do not know what that software is. That's the first thing that pops to my mind, right? How often did you hear nobody knows that's some mainframe stuff Joe did and Joe retired 15 years ago and Joe was a superstar, right? Nobody knew what he was doing.
But now they got to maintain it because they don't have a choice. That's what they're running the business on. Well, on today's show, we have Robert Cooke on. Robert, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. This conversation is based on something that we were sort of preparing for this. This item of, this number just sounds insane to me. Companies spend 70% of their tech budget on maintaining legacy systems. That just seems insane to me. Why is that, Robert?
Well, because it's only 2022. Next year, it'll be 72%. And the year after that, it'll be 74%. And then it's just going to keep going up, in my opinion, until it reaches a threshold where it's 100%, unless we change something. And I think that, if we were sitting here having this, well, I guess it wouldn't have been a podcast, it would have been a phone call 20 years ago, that number would have been a far less. And so that number's headed in a direction, and I think it's in a direction for disaster. So I could talk a lot about that, but I do think that this all started with a concept, because I remember when I started building software professionally in the late 90s, there's kind of this concept of just build it, make it work, and we'll save a lot of money, because the alternative is to do everything by hand. So the idea of building systems that could be maintained wasn't really necessarily as much of a thing. I think it was more about just building stuff, getting it out there, because the ROI, the return on investment for building anything, taking anything that was being manually done and making it automated, you could save a lot of money. And the idea was just throw more money at it, make it go away, make it electronically driven, and we'll save money. And then you keep doing that, but you don't pay any attention to how to maintain those systems. You end up in a lot of trouble there. Another analogy I like to make. I consider myself kind of a classically trained computer scientist. I love computers, everything to do with computers. I've spent a lot of time, and I think there's an analogy to be made here. I've spent a lot of time thinking about data structures. And one thing I've always realized about data structures, when you're building, let's say, a map, like a tree map or something like that, the actual logic to make it so that you can remove elements from a map, the code involved there is much more than the code to put the elements into the map in the first place. And the reason I think that's a very good analogy, and another way is, the way I put it is, it's easy to insert information. It's relatively medium effort to update information, and it's very difficult to delete things, because when you delete things, you don't know what sort of impact that's going to have unless you've kind of future-proofed it so that you know you're going to be deleting these things later on. So my point is, when you're building systems, if you're not thinking and preparing a playbook for how you're eventually going to decommission those systems, it will come and bite you. And again, when you create something as simple as a map in as a data structure, you have to, as you're building that, you have to think about what happens when people want to delete from it. So you have to actually think about that ahead of time. I don't think people do that when they're building large, complex software systems. In fact, I know they're not. So I think that's why we're at 70%. And again, I think that number is just going to go up if unabated.
That reminds me a lot like discussions we had long time ago about testing, manual versus automated testing. And I was actually giving the same argument in favor of automated testing. Is okay, so right now you're 30% of the workforce is doing testing because the system is this big, but we know that the system will continue growing, right? And how do you expect that to scale?
That's right. And I would say both of those, when it comes to testing and building systems, is you actually end up with literally an exponential problem, which is in the beginning when you're testing, and if you only have, let's just say we're doing GUI testing and you have a form, and that form has 3 fields. Well, you have a certain set of combinations to try. Let's say they're checkboxes. You have 8 combinations. They're all unchecked, they're all checked, or some combination of that. You add a 4th checkbox. Now you've got 16 things to test. You had a 5th checkbox. You add a 10th checkbox. You're now up to 1,000 different combinations. It very quickly becomes unwieldy. And that's just checkboxes on a form. Very simple. But the math holds true. Now, so if you're going to manually test every time you add a new checkbox, you need to double your staff once you really reach a large enough number. And obviously forms aren't just checkboxes or inputs and this and that. So it becomes very unwieldy. And I think the same thing is true with systems, which is when you have, and I think, I come from fintech, where I think when you start to get to architecture senior level in IT, you're thinking about systems. Like this system interacts with that system. Our algo trading system sends information to our smarter router, and our smarter router sends things to our direct market access, and our et cetera, et cetera. So you're thinking about things in kind of a systems orientation. And every time you add a new system, it's integrated with all those other systems. So once again, you end up with this exponential problem where every time you add a new system, let's say you've got 5 systems, you add a 6th, well, you're actually creating 5 interactions. And then you add that 7th system, and now you're adding 6 interactions just by adding 1 system. And every time you do that, you end up with this massive complex system of interlocking pieces, and it becomes very, very difficult to test. And now we come back to the beginning of the conversation, which is, well, why does it cost so much to maintain that? It's because you end up with this exponential growth thing. And in the beginning, something that you could do manually just becomes overwhelmingly complex and overwhelmingly expensive, I would say.
But there is alternative option, which I believe is commonly taken, and that's our only option is to start ignoring parts of it. Right? We're not going to do regression testing anymore. We're going to test only the new features because we cannot do it. Or we're going to leave this piece of something that Joe wrote and that whole company depends on in a closet and hope that it just continues working forever and ever.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that is the alternative you have to take. I mean, if we go back to the checkboxes that I was talking about before, and that wasn't, as that analogy, at some point you can't afford to check every combination. So you're like, well, we'll just assume those first 50 checkboxes work. And then you can make it a linear problem. The problem is you're not actually testing or paying attention to your whole system anymore. And so I would say that is practically the only thing I see, which is, yes, you just start to ignore and assume the old legacy stuff works. It's kind of like, I'm not sure if it was the Matrix 2 or the Matrix 3 where like they look down and they're like, we have no idea what that stuff does down there. Those computers and gears, they just run and they just work. We don't even know how they work anymore. And, the whole problem is, well, now how do you upgrade and add value to that and maintain it? Yeah.
As we're recording this, there's a company that is just shutting systems down. because only 20% needs to be running. I'm not going to name it. Doesn't really matter.
If you say the date when we're recording, everybody is going to know what the company is.
I know. Well, Robert's already sort of leaked it. We're recording this in 2020, towards the end of 2022. So that's it. Now, like it or not, there's probably reasonable truth. Let's not get political about it, but there's probably at least a seed of truth in this. Back to what you were saying, when we were creating these systems, we weren't looking ahead for future-proofing. We just weren't. Maybe a little, okay, just a small slice. How could any of us known that we were moving from spindles on disk to SSD? None of us could have seen that coming. Well, some of us could, not me.
I don't think that not future-proofing is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's quite okay to make something that is not future-proof. I think it's not okay not to understand the depth and the consequences of making such a decision. There is a time when you want to move fast, and there is a time when you want to make things right. I don't think that there is inherent problem in either of those two choices. The problem is not understanding the consequences of those choices so that you can make a decision really whether to do A or B.
Right. Well, first off, I think future proofing, and maybe I'm the one who introduced that term on this podcast. I mean, that isn't an exact, first off, I think that's probably unrealistic try to make something future proof. I get that. But yes, I think it is attainable to say when we build and we introduce new systems to understand what sort of connections it has to other systems, what sort of systemic risk there is if that system goes down or if that system is removed. Another thing I see that happens a lot of times, which I think ends up adding a lot of costs down the road, is that you have a system. And again, I'm just using the term system generically. I'll give an example. You have a system which is a golden copy of all of your securities and all of your reference data. And there's a correct way to access that information. And then at some point you say, you know what? We need to get this done. We need to get this product out. Bonuses are coming up. We need to get this feature out. And then you end up kind of bypassing the standard APIs or the standard way you should access it and then go directly to the database or do something else because it's just 1,000 times easier. You don't have to go through this reference committee and all these things. You just go to the database. There's no harm in that. That's fine. Okay, you go to the database, you make the connection, you do the query. But the problem is once you've done that, now someone else says, oh, well, you just do that. And then all of a sudden, all these people start building these systems that just go and ask data and start collecting data. And now there isn't a really good catalog of how these are being used. And now that fear sets in. Well, what happens if we upgrade our security master from MySQL 7 to MySQL 8, whatever, pick whatever you want. And now there's this real fear because all these different things are just interacting however they want. And so I think a lot of this could be, and so now I think the industry has learned a lot of lessons. And now I think a big part of growing up as an industry is to be more disciplined about how we start to build these things going forward. And I do think, things like REST APIs, I'm not like a big REST API guy myself, but I do believe concepts like that, where you have APIs in certain groups, they own that data and they own that API, and they basically manage those interactions and things like that. It makes it so that down the road, these systems, we can understand how they interact with other systems and we can do a better job of upgrading them. But, I still think there's a lot of systemic risk just because of all of the legacy systems and frankly, new systems that are still built today. I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes that happens is, at least in fintech, we are on an annual cycle. I mean, there are projects come out, budgets are assigned, teams are created, people are hired, expectations need to be met by certain parts of the year. So compensations, et cetera, et cetera. And so sometimes there are shortcuts taken to get things out the door quickly. And you can usually take those shortcuts and make deadlines. But the problem is you're actually adding a ton of technology debt onto the book along with that solution that someone else has to, it's kind of like someone else has to basically pay that mortgage later on because it is going to come due, when you take those shortcuts.
Does it mean that in fintech, the code written in first half of the year tends to be better than the code written in the second? closer to the deadline?
Ooh, that's a good question. I haven't done that. I haven't done that. Well, I think, yeah, definitely you'll see, I would bet you would see different style of coding in different parts of the year. Yes. I can't say whether it's better or worse or more frantic or less frantic, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely certain motivation to get things done in a period of time. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I stepped out and started the company 3Forge, because I felt that the sort of technology that I wanted to build needed 5 years to do that. And there was just no way to get, even if I could, and I did get senior management at times to buy into a 5-year budget. The problem is that senior management revolves every 24 to 32 months. And then when they revolve, what's the low hanging fruit? Well, it's this 5-year build out. You know what I mean? Why are we focusing on this when we should be focusing on tomorrow instead, or, this week instead of this decade? So anyways, that's why I stepped out and started 3Forge, was to get that time and build that platform. And I think now we're reaping the benefits of that. But I do think, again, it comes back to having the discipline to understand that sometimes really good things do take a little bit more time.
Also, I have impression, I would like to hear your opinion, that often shortcuts are taken to do things faster, right? But I've seen teams that actually do things equally fast the right way, or whatever the right means, kind of the better way, as through shortcuts. So I have impression that it's not only it's also partly the experience of the team, right? Kind of somebody who already built the system 3 times certain way, probably is going to take not considerably more time to do it 4th time the same way than the easy way.
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, I will concede, I think I'm the one who introduced the term shortcut on this podcast. I would say it shortcuts often, but often they're also just lack of experience and understanding why. I learn by example a lot of times, and I learn by my mistakes. I like doing woodworking and other sorts of projects, and I kind of just invent things and it doesn't work, and then I realize, oh well, that's not the right way to do this. This is, and you learn by example. And I think it's the same thing in software. Unfortunately, there's a huge cost when people learn things on a Fortune 500's dime when it comes to building these systems. So right, it might not intentionally be a shortcut. I guess from my vantage point, after doing this for several decades, I look at it, I perceive it as a shortcut. Like, well, why did you do this instead of doing it this proper way? But yeah, it's just a lot of times lack of understanding and knowing the right way to do something. And especially, I can imagine you're straight out of college, you're going in to solve a problem. And if you don't have a lot of handholding and a lot of experience, your goal is just to get it to work. Copy and paste off of Stack Overflow, get it in there, make it work,
That copy and paste, that's what you said earlier, resonated a lot when you were talking about the example, going directly to the database, querying the database, or putting something in the database instead of going through API or whatever. I did those things many times, just as many. I'm freak about testing, and many times I actually wrote code without testing, but as a conscious decision, I want to do this now, right now, in an hour, to prove that something works. But that copying and pasting, to me, that sounds like a real problem, right? Because if I make a conscious decision to skip something because I'm going to get back to it, I think that that's fine. But if you're going to copy and paste my code without understanding that the reasons why I did that, then we are switching from conscious shortcut or whatever we want to call it to unintentional replication of something very, very silly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes we make conscious decisions. And by the way, when it comes to, unit testing or putting together an integration test, I think kind of the gloves come off. I mean, you can hack things together if it's just putting together a test to hit a system, and it doesn't necessarily need to be efficient or performant or things like that. You just want to be able to test the system. But you're right, when that code manages to leak its way into a production environment, that's when you have, that's when you start to have to question that. Yeah.
So I want to go back to my point. I'm going to get rid of 80% of my systems. Magic hand wave. Now let's assume that that's the right thing to do. Those things aren't really being used, air quote. How do we safely eliminate systems that we don't need? I don't think we can just rip them out day one, but I also don't think we can wait 10 years to rip them out either, because the debt on that's going to keep on paying and paying and paying.
I have to speak from my background where I don't think I don't think it's true that 80% of the systems aren't being used. In fact, I'd say 100% of the systems add some sort of functionality. You might be able to argue that 80% of the code in some of these systems is not really very useful or being used much anymore, or is largely copy and paste and can be eliminated or streamlined. But at least when I think about, I mean, we might have, I still, so again, 3Forge, we have adapters to just about every type of database there is. And yes, I still see mainframes being used for doing a lot of back office stuff. Now, these systems are written in COBOL. Most COBOL developers are retiring or have retired. And so it's very hard to even find engineers to support these systems. But at the same time, those systems still provide a useful service. Now, they could be written and modernized and done far more efficiently on much cheaper hardware. They would operate a lot faster. They could have much better tooling. But at the end of the day, someone has to do that forklift of saying, I'm going to take this old code, figure out what is necessary, migrate it onto a new system. And then the other problem is, the way I look at it is, there isn't a clean separation between, let me take this another way. I look at it as, especially in fintech and most hosted solutions, there isn't a very good divide between the software and the data. It's almost like between the schema and the data itself. And so you end up with this living thing where it's like, you can't just say, here's my business logic and here's all the data, because the data and the business logic become very mixed. And so the migration from one system to another isn't just about rewriting the code. It's also about getting all the data moved in tandem from one to another. And I think the great tragedy, and I think this is why people are really scared of this, is I would say 50%, maybe more than 50% of the rewrites I'm aware of, not that I've been involved with, but that I'm aware of, resulted in just having two systems instead of one. So you're like, we've got this old system that does, I don't know, tax and rebates. It's sitting on COBOL from the 1970s, and we're going to rebuild that system. And then you rebuild it and you get 90% of the logic moved over, but not 100%. Some of these edge conditions you can't figure out, or you just don't have the time to get through it. You go live with that. So now 90% of your flow, your straight through processing, is done by this new modern system, but then you've still got 10% that's done by this old system. And now you've got two systems. And now you've got to ask yourself, are you even in a better situation than you were before? So you've got to really be willing to go 100%. So I'm just I'm not necessarily sitting here giving answers on this, but I'm saying that that's, it is a concern. And so at least from my vantage point, I don't look at it as 80% of the stuff isn't being used. I look at it as 80% of the stuff is woefully unmaintained and unmaintainable and needs to be replaced and rewritten and updated and made secure. We sit here and talk about, that can be another avenue we can probably talk about for a long time, which is a lot of these systems are still using FTP. Not FTPS, right? They're still like sending username and passwords, if there is a password, on systems that didn't even understand lowercase letters. And we still have systems built on that. They have absolutely no security baked into them. And those systems need to be updated and replaced. At the same time, it's again, no one thought about it when they built them. No one really thinks about, how am I going to write software so I can be replaced? That's just not something people think about.
No, because they're going to figure, I'll be here for 3-5 years and I'm going to go on to the next place. Mm-hmm. This isn't going to be my problem long term.
Right. I feel like we're just complaining a lot, but I'll go with it, because I agree. And in fact, I think that's another problem we have, is that the job cycle. I think in a modern technologist, they leave and go to a new job between 24 and 36 months. And so they're just, it's not like my father's generation where people would go to a company and work there for 20 years. And they actually felt like, well, if I screw this up, I'm going to have to own this for the next 20 years. Yeah, it's just, you come in, you build it, you go on Indeed or something and you find your next job and you move on. And yeah, it's a small community, other people, but.
But, is it a good or a bad thing? Because in the past, I think it was a bit different, right? Like if you go like 20, 30 years ago, people were sticking to their jobs in software longer. I'm not going to say for life, but longer. And then we had a different type of problem. It's kind of like you built it 20 years ago, you're managing it for 20 years, you retire, and now kind of there is no human being on earth who knows what you did and how you did it, and kind of like you're the last one who knew that technology, kind of like last man on earth.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's a certain stigma with that also. But I do think that there's kind of a happy medium. And right now, I think we're definitely on the short side where people will come in, build systems. But I guess the one thing that is coming out of that, with the fact that people are so fungible, I hate to use that term, but that at least the careers are so fungible. They come in, they come out. That I mean, corporations are building systems that are key man proof. I suppose you could say, right? So they understand that people are going to come and go. And again, so I think a lot of this is that I think the industry is moving ahead. And by the way, I will say I think that this conversation, if for the listeners, is there's a huge opportunity to compete against some of these really large firms that have these legacy systems, because I think a lot of the tools and concepts are in place now for building systems that, again, if you follow these rules and rigors that I think are fairly established now, you can build systems that can be maintained by a revolving door of employees and can be expanded and understood and decommissioned and all of those great things. But the problem is, again, for these large corporations, they're dealing with systems that weren't built with that same sort of concept in mind. And so they're kind of fighting that.
What you're explaining is a problem only if others in your industry are not in the same situation. I have a feeling that like financial industry, until not long ago, everybody had those things and nobody was really truly worried about it because everybody knew that everybody else is in the same situation, right?
Correct.
And I have a feeling that last couple of years, financial institutions are actually changing drastically how they see those things.
They have to.
Because all of a sudden now we do have competition. Now there are actually players that are not in equally bad shape as we are, right?
Yeah, no competition and capitalism at work. I mean, it is a good thing. I mean, the thing I always think about is, if we make an analogy, it's like all the automakers, they sat there on their gas-powered vehicles forever and they didn't really have to think about it. And as long as no one came up with an electric car, no one needed to worry about it, right? Then once someone did, all of a sudden everyone wakes up and says, we have to focus on this or we're going to get slaughtered by our competitors. And then you do it. So, right. So I agree.
But then comes the question, if you follow that logic, kind of like no need to worry, kind of it's fine. It comes, Tesla comes, say, it's completely different. Is it too late then? Kind of like how feasible it is. I know that it's not too late for everybody, but for many companies, they might be at a point that actually it's not feasible actually for me anymore. Kind of like I cannot catch up.
Well, I mean, look, I'm not going to pretend to be a CFO or understand exactly how these budgets work, but I do know what the budgets are like for your typical investment bank, and they have many, many zeros, and so they have a lot of fighting power to replace and to update these systems. So I think, and I hate to throw out the term, too big to fail, because I don't know if that's necessarily true, but they do have huge customer base. They have huge global presence, tons of branding. So they have a lot of things at their back, but they also have a lot of legacy systems. So it's interesting challenges. I think it's very interesting, the sort of complex, I guess you could say, Rubik's Cube that that senior management folk in IT in fintech had to deal with. Yeah. But I do think I think that the just the enormous amount of capital they have gives them fighting power. But at the same time, I also think there's much, and again, I have to say this is why I stepped outside, because I do believe there is a limit to, you can spend an infinite amount of money, and if you're not spending it the right way, you're actually not going to get a product that's good. You're still just going to find issues. You're still going to end up with these same struggles. And so that's why I stepped outside and said, look, we're going to design and build a platform that as a consortium that the banks can use to then rapidly build applications internally.
So with those struggles, you were talking about rules and rigor a few minutes ago. What are some of the things that we should be putting into our tool belt today in 2023?
I think I like your forward thinking in 2023. Yes. Well, okay. This is going to be a bit controversial, but I do think our dependence on open source is highly overrated. I think that open source does create a lot of issues in terms of, I could say, performance. And I think a lot of time is spent on trying to manage the dependency trees around all this. And I'm speaking specifically around Java and Python. I think those are particular examples where I think they're good languages. I think Java is better, but I think they're good languages, and I think they serve a purpose. But the problem is, you have all these libraries that also, I'm not, from a security standpoint, I also have deep concerns around that as well with the open source. So I think if you're asking what are some of the rules and rigors that we should put in place, I think there's the standard things, like I think following, a standard DevOps protocol makes sense, and I can go through that, but I think that's, pretty available online to read through, and I give my war stories on that. But I think something that is going to unfold is that we need to have a lot more control around open source. And by the way, I can see this now I'm installed in most of the tier 1 banks at this point, and several of the tier 1 banks have now stopped the concept where developers can go and just grab open source and use it. It has to go through a process and be vetted, and they have to understand what the versioning is like and what companies behind it, what is their revenue model. And usually it has to go through some sort of penetration testing, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm seeing this in drips and drabs, and I think it's going to go further in that direction, because I think a lot of time and money has been spent trying to manage and maintain these complex open source or systems built on open source. And by the way, I think for any developer who's worked on a complex system would agree that it's not uncommon to have a product that uses 1 to 200 open source libraries. That's perfectly common. And just the amount of overhead and maintenance to try to support that becomes quite complex. And of course, there's tools like Maven and things that try to make it easier. In fact, without Maven, I think it would be virtually hopeless. But even then, you still end up with a lot of confusion in trying to maintain that. And like I said, I think there's a lot of avenues of problems that I can go down with open source. And I do think it does bring value, though, but there's got to be careful about how it's used.
Is there closed source software today that is not built on top of open source?
Well, 3Forge isn't.
Okay.
Our software is
cool.
not.
So that still must be some kind of exception, right? Because I see closed source all the time, and then I discovered that closed source platform uses Log4j, kind of how likely it is that the platform that you just purchased developed its own logging mechanism. I'm just using it as example, right? Kudos to you guys, but there aren't many.
Well, we did. It's actually one of the first things we did was write our own logging system, because we could probably build it faster and more integrated, and then all the security issues. Put that aside. I'm not saying that there is. How do I put this? When we talk about closed source systems, I guess we're going to have to look at the platform it's built on. If it's a Java implementation, which we are, I would say, as someone who embraces Java, we're probably one of the only firms in existence to not use open source. I will admit that. And we systematically went through and removed any open source we had.
I'm going to play devil's advocate. You are using JVM running on Linux.
We are using the JVM running on Linux. Yes, correct.
And both of them being open source. It's unavoidable to a certain level, right? That's what I'm trying to say.
Correct. And so and I'm not saying, so here's the thing, you don't have to run it on Linux. I would advocate you do. And by the way, I think there's also issues with Linux, how it's being deployed also. But again, it isn't, I guess the question was, what can we think about for 2023? And maybe it's a little premature 2023, but I think this is going to be a hot button conversation in the second half of this decade, which is about these open source things. Now, first off, if you wanted to, you could go use, something that's very well supported. Like I said, it's not that you shouldn't use open source. It's just you have to start to really understand where that is coming from. So yes, you could use CentOS. You could also choose to use Red Hat Enterprise, right? Now it's being at least maintained and monitored, and hopefully they're paying attention to the patches that are going out there. That's why Red Hat kind of exists, in my opinion. Instead of using an open JVM, you could choose to use, Oracle's modern JVM that's basically supported and warranted. And unfortunately, you have to pay for it, but you could use that if you wanted to. And again, it's just going to come down to understanding the community around that. Now, when I say we don't use open source, I'm basically saying we don't bundle any open source with it. I mean, when we give it to you, if you decide to run it on an open source platform, that's your choice. I mean, frankly, when we integrate, let's say, with MongoDB as an example, well, you're going to use the MongoDB library that you could argue that's open source. So we didn't go write our own MongoDB library. I don't even know if we could be licensed to do that. We're basically saying, okay, if you're going to connect to MongoDB, use the MongoDB thing. At the same time, MongoDB, again, that's a large company. They're up on 42nd Street, or whatever, 44th Street. I've been there several times. It's a large company. They're maintaining it. You understand what you're getting. So I think there's examples of where it can be used. Now you flip it around and you're like, Log4j, I probably should know. I don't really know how Log4j or who is actually maintaining it. We stopped using it a very long time ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago. But I think that's where the problems lie.
From my perspective, the really core issue over there is, I see, depending on the cases, very good usage, open source being a good choice, or closed source, or SaaS, right? There are many alternatives. What I think is a real problem is companies not understanding the investment that needs to be made in one or the other. Like, there is that thinking, hey, I have two options. I can buy a license for this something and it will cost me X, or I can take this open source platform that does something similar, it costs me nothing. That's the core of the issue to me, because it's not costing nothing.
Right. And now we come back to that $20 at the
exactly.
top of the call.
Kind
right?
of both options, depending on the circumstances and this or that, could be valid options, but you need to understand that if you're using open source, then you must be prepared to maybe create a patch to that project. Kind of not cry when somebody finds a vulnerability and you say, and nobody's fixing it. No, you chose to use open source. You need to pay the price for that. And that there are many shades. Like, it could be RHEL, right? RHEL, open source, but you're paying somebody else to do the work for you, to check whether it's valid, right? And companies not understanding the price of open source, that's what bothers me, really.
I think another thing too, when I look at open source a lot of times, and by the way, my method of attack here was, we founded the company in 2012. We couldn't afford to just say we're going to not use any open source. We're going to build everything from scratch and delay delivery for 10 years while we build everything. So we used a lot of open source, and then we systematically went through and removed the components over time once we felt comfortable doing it. And I can say a few things. One, open source, and not to rip on all open source, I haven't evaluated everything, but most of the things I've evaluated, they're really not paying attention to performance. They really, it's just ship product, get it working and ship product. And so you are paying a cost there. And I know computers are super fast now, so you're like, well, performance doesn't matter. But eventually it does matter, especially if it's like core libraries that are sitting inside tight for loops. That stuff does matter. You're eventually, I'm not going to say the electric bill matters that much, but you're paying for it through hardware. You're also paying through it through performance. But I think when it comes down to using open source, I think what to me is shocking, and we've just gone through this SOC 2 compliance thing, and all the rigors and standards that you need to have to be a SOC 2 compliant corporation. But to me, one of the scariest things, and really didn't even come up in this, is that I know so many companies that literally have an open door, which basically says, oh, when there's a new version of this open source software, just download it. Just download it almost automatically. Just download it, right? First off, from a vulnerability standpoint, if someone gets a virus into that, which really wouldn't be that hard to do, and then it gets downloaded into your organization, that's no one's fault but your own. Like you said, you made the choice to use that. You also made the choice to configure it that way. It does make your life a little bit easier. The second thing too is theoretically, or I shouldn't say theoretically, practically, people make changes to that open source code, and for the better. They're trying to improve things, but it ends up breaking something locally, and now it becomes very difficult to test and understand what's going on. And there's all the systemic risk there. So I just think that open source, and of course, I know it sounds a little cliche. I mean, I'm a software, I run a software company that licenses and sells software. So, on one hand, you say, well, you don't like open source because you're trying to sell software. But no, I've been on both sides of this for a long time, and I've definitely seen that if you're going to use open source software, at least what I would generally do when I ran teams is I would have a dedicated person that managed the open source software. So let's say I had a team of 20 people. I'd have one person. That's all they did was maintain the open source software, reading, understanding, getting the right versions. You call them a build master if you want, but you're paying that cost. And if the idea is that you're just going to use a bunch of open source software, I think one is asking for trouble there in the long run.
So it sounds like part of our problems from 20 years ago is because of open source. Am I overstating that too much? Because that's really when open source started coming out 20 years ago-ish.
Right. Well, open source is, I don't know if one caused the other necessarily, but yeah, it is an interesting two things juxtaposition to each other where, open source comes out just as we're also facing these legacy issues. I think, open source, it was almost an inevitability because in a way, open source costs nothing to, it's kind of like free music. I mean, it's an inevitability that there's going to be artists out there who write this software and make it free, and then other people can use it. I think it would have happened regardless. Or maybe I didn't understand the question. You did, and you answered the way I thought you would. As we're getting ready to wrap up, I got two more questions. When you were talking about, you initially started out with some open source, but then you systematically removed those over time. Is that a strategy that people should be doing now? Knowing that technical debt is always growing and growing, should we, as we're constructing our systems today, start figuring out, okay, how can I eventually take this out? Instead of future-proofing, do we just start saying, how do I demise this in however long? Okay, that's a good question. So I can't say I know other companies or groups that have really taken that approach. But what I can say is it's worked out incredibly well for us. So as I don't, one point is not necessarily a trend, but for 3Forge, it's worked out extremely well. And I can say on a few fronts. One, suddenly it is much easier for us to understand when there's an issue, where that issue is coming from, diving through that, because all of the expertise is now in-house and we can do that. The other thing I'd say is the cost of, a lot of times these open source libraries, you end up downloading, like, let's say Apache Commons, just pick that one. Apache Commons Text, unfortunately, I think is one that had the 0-day bug recently, or vulnerability. But in any case, you download that comes with thousands and thousands of tools, of which you might be using, a dozen. So you just take the dozen that you need and you write those, and then you can optimize them. So it gives you a chance to write much, much better code. And the other thing that I think is fascinating is, we go through vendor onboarding all the time. Every year we bring on new vendors, we go through the vendor onboarding process. And the reason I bring this up is the vendor onboarding process today, from a security standpoint, is nothing like it was even 24 months ago. 24 months ago, I don't think there was a single question on what open source software do you use. Now there's entire forms. Like when we go into a bank, I'm curious how other vendors go in, what happens, because when we go in, they say, here's this form, please fill this out, tell us all your vulnerabilities, please tell us all your dependencies. That's a Freudian slip there. Please tell us all your dependencies on open source software. Please tell us how you maintain them, when they're upgraded, et cetera. And we can just draw a big X through that and say we don't use any open source. So if firms are so concerned about vendors using open source, they've got to be asking themselves this internally about the systems they're building as well. Like, how are we using this open source stuff? So I think over time, it does reap benefits. And I know it sounds a little crazy. It sounds a little crazy to say we're just going to start rewriting this code internally just because. But we did it for financial reasons. We did it for financial and security reasons. And I think it's worked out very well. It's kind of take the pain once and then you move on. And so I would suggest it. I think it's an open debate though, but I would suggest it.
So my last question, you said you're a Java shop at 3Forge. What version of Java are you using right now?
We still support, believe it or not, all the way back to Java 1.6 or 1.7. We tell our customers they should only be using 1.8 or later for security reasons, and we're up to 1.17, up to 17, Java 17. So, but we try to be as backwards compatible as we can, because sometimes we do have firms that are still running, paid for JVMs that are quite old, specialized JVMs, and so we want to make sure we can run on those.
And I wanted to say that out loud, just because people say, well, no, everybody should just be running 11 or 17 right now because, again, 8 isn't out, but it's effectively out.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted people to hear, no, at these financial institutions, you would be shocked at how much money is running through these systems that we would consider dead and gone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Java 1.6 is tough to come by now, but 1.7, 1.8, you'll definitely see all over the place. And that's actually another reason, there's another problem with open source is the dependencies get very complicated.
Doesn't that introduce just as big or even bigger security risk? Because I haven't been using Java in a while, so what I'm going to say might be very silly, but I would guess that it's similar like other stuff that between Java 1.8 or whatever it is and whatever is today, yes, some vulnerabilities were introduced, but many were removed. One of the ways how we remove potential threats is by applying the upgrades, by applying the patches to all those things, right?
All right. Well, I mean, our official stance is you should always be on something that has not been end of life and should be current with security patches.
I'm more talking from the perspective of a company concerned about security for a very, very good reason, right? But then ignoring the big part of security, kind of, you should be, from security perspective, relatively up to date. So the fact that you are, in a way, for everything new coming, you are vetting it, and I'm all for it, and making sure that it's secure.
Mm-hmm.
But then I ignore those. What did you say? 70%.
Here you go. Well, this comes right back to the issue of legacy systems. So it is a challenge, by the way, for us to be compliant with 1.6 all the way up to 17. And the reason is because once you get to, I think it's 11, 12, 13, somewhere in that range, Oracle starts removing features that they think are insecure. So we have to make sure that we've also removed anything that would depend on those features, right? But now imagine you've got that team, they've built, an order management system, that team's long gone, and it relied on those features. It's very hard now to upgrade to 1.13 because you're going to have to go and actually literally change the code in order for it to run on it. I guess my point is, in an effort to make it more secure, they've actually done some backwards compatible things. And so backwards incompatible things. And so, so that's why I think in some cases they're not running on the latest version. At the same time, you can. And again, I'm not going to sit here and advocate running old versions of Java, but you can take old versions of Java and update them with the latest security patches and make them secure. Another thing I would say too is a lot of the firms, and this is from a security standpoint, there's kind of perimeter security, which is, you kind of have a big electric fence around the whole organization. And that's how you manage security. And then you manage it. You have like your DMZ, and then you have your production environment. And the understanding is, even if everything running in production is insecure, you can't get to it. Now, ideally, you should have layered security. you should have your electric fence, you should have your card reader, you should have this. I'm speaking in analogies now, but all the way down to, yes, you should have secure passwords to get onto the server, and you should have your latest libraries and all of these things. So yeah.
No, of course. I mean, kind of, I was more referring, or to put another example, kind of like, hey, you cannot use this for this reason, but you can run Debian from 17 years ago, kind of like as your operating system. Kind of, hey.
Yeah, it is tough though, because I'll give you a counter analogy, which is CentOS 7 versus CentOS 8. A lot of firms went through the effort of upgrading from CentOS 7 to CentOS 8. I don't know if you paid attention, CentOS 8 has actually already been end of life before CentOS 7 because it was so unpopular. So there is also a risk in keeping on the latest trend. So anyways, it's another conversation, but each firm's got to make its decision and its choices as to how up to date it wants to be. And I think there's a balance. And the balance is not Java 1.6. It's later than that, but
Yes, please. Much later than 1.6. Preferably at least 11. Preferably at least 11. Because that's getting ready to go end of life soon enough as well. So, Robert, thanks for being with us today. If people wanted to get in touch with you or learn more about 3Forge, what's the best way to do that?
So 3Forge on LinkedIn is our social media. So that's definitely the place. We're always looking for more followers there. We're always doing posts and updates on new systems and ways we connect. And then, of course, visit 3forge.com. That's where we have information about our platform and kind of our philosophy towards building complex systems and so forth.
I'll have all that contact information down in the show notes. Robert, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.